Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, U.S. Podcast Ad Spend Forecast, Strategies for a $2 billion Opportunity. I'm your host, Paul Verna, Principal Analyst at Insider Intelligence in New York, and I'm joined by my colleague, Senior Analyst Ross Benish, also in New York. Hi, Ross, great to have you here.
Hey, Paul, good to be here.
Before we get into the main presentation, I'd like to thank Spotify Advertising for making today's webinar possible, and I'd like to welcome Rochelle Sanchirico, Global Director of SMB Marketing at Spotify Advertising. Rochelle is joining us from a work travel destination in beautiful Charleston, South Carolina. Hi, Rochelle.
Hi, Paul. It's great to be with you here today.
So a few things before we dive in. We have a ton of information to share, but there's no need to take notes. We'll email you a link to view the slides and the full recording, but we do want you to participate. So just use the chat window on the right to submit questions at any time during the presentation. We'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A. So with that, Ross, let's get started. What's on the agenda today?
Well, I want to begin by discussing advertising. So we forecast that U.S. podcast ad spend will surpass $2 billion by the end of next year. And that's pretty significant considering that podcasts had only surpassed $1 billion in ad spend just last year. So this shows how brands are really coming into this space. It shows an acceleration of ad spend to go from $1 to $2 billion in just a 2-year period. And I predict that will be at $3 billion by the end of 2025. And as podcast ad spend has increased, it accounts for a much greater share of total digital audio ad dollars than it used to. So prior to the pandemic in 2019, podcasts were about 15% of total digital audio. By the end of next year, they will be more than 30%. So that's a doubling in its share of total digital audio ad dollars. There are various places that advertisers pull podcast ad dollars from. This data is from Advertiser Perceptions. They found that most advertisers did not have dedicated podcast budgets, and that the most common areas that they got podcast ad dollars were from overall digital budgets and digital audio budgets. But I predict that as podcasts attract more ad dollars, the number of marketers who have dedicated budgets for podcasting will grow. And when you have dedicated budgets, that signals that the medium is no longer experimental, but it's one that is essential part of marketers' media mix. Media Radar broke down podcast ad spending by industry, finding that tech, media, and finance were the largest spenders. Media is the most interesting because if you look at media and entertainment ad spending across all of digital advertising, you find that it takes about 1/10 of total digital media advertising. But within podcasting, its share is higher at 15%. If you've listened to many podcasts, you've probably heard ads for theatrical releases, for other podcasts, or for streaming video services. So podcasts are a medium that is regularly used to market other media products. The Media Radar study also found that just over half of podcast ads were mid-rolls. This made mid-rolls the most common ad placement. They were also the most expensive ad placement, and that the number of brands running podcast ads per year continues to grow by double digits. For the first time, we have forecasted Spotify's US podcast ad revenues. We predict that they will reach around $200 million by the end of this year and more than double between now and the end of 2024 to surpass $400 million. As this has happened, the share of total Spotify ad revenues that goes to podcasts shot up significantly. And by the end of 2024, it will be about 1/5 of their whole ad business. We also forecast ad revenues for Iheart Media. We predict that Iheart Media will account for about 1/5 of the total US podcast ad market by the end of this year and about 1/4 by the end of 2024. Iheart is a little different than many of the digital-centric players because they have a large portfolio of terrestrial radio stations, and Many of their podcasts are traditional radio talk shows that have been transported to become digital podcasts, and that gives them more control over ad inventory. And what I'm getting at with that is that with most podcasting, there is a non-exclusivity as far as how distribution goes. So if we take our Behind the Numbers podcast as an example, we record it and then we put it on Spotify and Stitcher and YouTube and SoundCloud and many other platforms. It's not unusual for a single podcast episode to be featured across 10 different platforms or more. Additionally, podcasters often sell inventory themselves and bake the ad right into the episodes. That's much different than allowing the platform who's doing the hosting to control the ad revenue. That does happen, particularly in cases where a show is an original, but most podcasts are not original to the platform they're hosted on. And additionally, I want to call out that subscriptions are very common in digital audio. Some ads will slip through a paywall, especially if it's a host-read ad that's baked directly into an episode, but other ads may be blocked. So these factors create an uneven relationship between podcast listening and ad revenue going toward the platform where the listening is happening. So the last few slides, I was looking at podcast ad revenues. That is who is receiving the most podcast ad dollars. This slide, I'm looking at podcast ad spending, which advertisers are spending the most on the medium. This data is from Magellan AI. They found that the online therapy service BetterHelp was the largest podcast ad spender last year. And what you see in this list is a reflection of what we saw earlier with tech, media, and finance advertisers indexing heavily on podcasting. Media advertiser would be NBCU, a tech example would be ExpressVPN, and a financial service advertiser would be Capital One. So although this is just a snapshot of 10 advertisers, it gives you some sense of what the industry looks like in terms of its advertiser mix. This data from NC Solutions is asking consumers how they feel about advertising. And about 1/3 of them said that podcast ads were a good way for advertisers to reach them, and a fourth found them enjoyable. That's pretty significant given that consumer sentiment isn't very high on most types of digital advertising. This shows that consumers actually have a little bit higher favorability toward podcast ads than they do toward other media. The Morning Consult had a similar study, and they found that 1/3 of consumers found podcast ads to be somewhat or very effective. Only 16% said they were not effective at all. So there is this belief, even among consumers, that podcast ads are pretty effective. Edison Research asked consumers if they believe that podcast ads are increasing, and they found the majority believe that they are. So Edison found that 6 in 10 podcast listeners believe ad loads are growing, 40% believe they're staying the same, and virtually no one believes they're declining. 3% is more or less a rounding error in studies like this. What has happened is that as more brands have come into podcasting, the ad loads have grown a little bit. Magellan AI has some data showing that the amount of time that ads take up of an entire episode is about 5% now. It's a little higher than it used to be, but still much lower than most other mediums when you consider that streaming video services tend to have 10 minutes or more per hour of ads. Podsights had some data on ad formats within podcasting, and they found that mid-rolls had the highest conversion rate. And that makes sense given that mid-rolls are when people are the most engaged with an episode. Right in the middle of an episode is where you may learn something shocking if you're listening to a true crime podcast episode, or you may be getting a nice piece of information if you're listening to a B2B episode. So that is the highest conversion rate, but it's also the most expensive according to data from Podchaser.
And Ross, on the topic of conversions, what are some of the ways that podcast ads can be measured or tracked?
Yeah, advertisers I talk to still will use some of those old school podcast tactics of coupon codes and vanity URLs. But as dynamic ad insertion becomes more of the norm, I expect those tactics will become more sophisticated. Podsights also had some data on ad exposure, And they showed that year over year, the number of times that an individual is exposed to a given ad has about doubled. It's still, not in dangerous levels like you see with streaming video, but it is significantly up over its 2020 levels. And there are a few reasons that drive this sort of trend. One of them is just that people are spending a lot more time listening to podcasts in general. So a user who listens to 2 hours per day, who used to listen to 1 hour per day, is more likely to be exposed to the same ad. And then additionally, the increased investment from brands has led to more ads being inserted into podcasts, which increases the likelihood of exposure as well. And now I'm going to discuss some listening data. So this chart is about the number of total podcast listeners in the United States. For the first time, the total number of listeners won't grow by double digits, but that's more of a sign of how big the base has become for podcasts. Podcasts will reach more than 125 million US consumers this year. That's more than 1/3 of the US population. Once you get a base that large, your percentage growth will decline just due to the law of large numbers. With podcast listeners, most new listeners are already familiar with digital audio. These aren't people who don't use digital audio who suddenly become podcasters. What's more common is it's someone who already streams music and they now listen to podcasts in addition to their music streaming. And that's why the share of digital audio listeners who tune into podcasts has expanded from about 1/2 pre-pandemic to about 2/3 by the end of our forecast period. For the first time ever, we broke out listening data by sex, and we found that the differences between male and female listening are pretty small, and they continue to diminish. So by the end of our forecast period in 2026, there will virtually be no difference between the likelihood that a male or a female will listen to podcasts. For marketers, that means that this isn't a media format that skews heavily toward one gender. It's one that is widely used across the entire population. And we also break out listening data by age and generation. This isn't terribly surprising, but Gen Z and millennials are the majority of podcast listeners. It just gives you some sense that this audience skews young. So these last few slides, I was focusing on listeners, the total number of people listening to podcasts. The next few slides, I'm going to look at time spent. And I want to be clear that this data in this slide is among the general population. So that includes people who don't even listen to podcasts. People like my parents who don't even know what a podcast are included in this data.
And how is it possible, Ross, that your parents don't know what a podcast is when you're a star cast member of the Weekly Listen on Behind the Numbers and other Behind the Numbers podcasts?
I haven't been a very good evangelizer to getting them to tune in, but every once in a while, my mom will hear me on NPR Marketplace when she's driving to work in the morning. So that's about as exciting as it gets for us.
It's a start.
It's a start, yeah. I'll hook them in later. So among the entire population, time spent with podcasts is going to grow by about 15% this year. That's significantly higher than the total number of listeners that are coming in to podcasts. And what that suggests when time spent growth is surpassing the number of listeners growth, it's that growth in this industry is coming from people who already listen to podcasts, just listening to more of them. We're seeing a lot of casual listeners becoming moderate listeners and moderate listeners becoming heavy listeners. And we're now at the point where podcasts are accounting for about 1/4 of total digital audio time spent. So most time spent digital audio still with music, but that podcast share keeps growing. This slide is similar to the last one, but we're looking at just podcast listeners in this slide. So people like my parents who don't listen to podcasts would not be included. And that's why there's a much higher listening time in this slide. So Among the entire population, podcast listening is about 23 minutes. That's what we just went over. Among podcast listeners, it's about 53 minutes per day. It's approaching an hour, and it's still growing at about 10% per year. This data from Edison will give you some insight into the number of episodes that people listen to per week. There are about 1/5 of podcast listeners who tune into more than 10 episodes per week. That is a huge amount of time, considering that podcast episodes are usually at least a half hour long. And the median is about 8 episodes per week, which is up over previous years. Edison also looked at where people do their listening. At home has always been the most common place where people do podcast listening, but its share jumped during COVID when people were stuck at home. It jumped by about 10 percentage points, and it stayed there even as activity has opened up. But I want to call out that the definition of home and work has become blended. Over the last 2 years, I haven't gone in the office much, but I've listened to podcasts as I put together webinars and presentations. I would count that as at-home listening because I'm doing it in my own home, but I'm doing it while I'm at work. So with that caveat, I just say that there's probably a little more listening happening at work than what is being captured here, just because work and home are one and the same for many individuals, particularly those who work in advertising. We forecast listeners for 2 companies, Spotify and Apple. Apple was the early juggernaut in this field. In fact, the word podcast derives from Apple's iPod. But Apple has become stagnant when it comes to podcast listeners, and we don't believe that they will surpass 30 million monthly US listeners by 2026. Whereas Spotify came into the space a little later, but has already exceeded Apple in listening, and the gap between the two will continue to expand as Spotify's listenership grows in the ensuing years. Edison, in its survey, asked users about many more services, and they were looking at heavy podcast listeners, those who listen to at least 5 hours per week. And Edison found that YouTube was actually the most common destination, followed by Spotify and Apple. YouTube is mostly a video service, but people should realize that it's also a very common destination for consumers to listen to music and to get podcasts. And with this Edison data, it's by service, not by company. So YouTube and Google Podcasts are separated here, as are Stitcher, Pandora, and SiriusXM. If subsidiaries were rolled up together into one company metric, YouTube or Google, I should say, and SiriusXM would rank a little higher on this list than what they show here. So my main takeaways are that podcast ad spend in the United States will surpass $2 billion by the end of next year. That's significant because it was only a year ago that it finally surpassed $1 billion. So the momentum is really there for advertising on podcasts. The growth in this industry is coming from people who already listen to podcasts, just doing much more of the same. Time spent is surpassing growth in the total number of listeners. That goes back to many moderate listeners becoming heavy listeners. And then as more money comes into podcasts, the ad loads are growing a little bit, but they're still lower than ad loads in most other digital media formats. However, listeners are aware the ad loads are growing, and it's something that podcasters should be aware of as they try to monetize their product. And that's all I have. I'll turn it over back to you, Paul.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Ross. Before we get to your questions live, we are now joined by Rochelle Sanchirico, Global Director of SMB Marketing at Spotify Advertising. Welcome again, Rochelle.
Thank you so much, Paul.
So I'd like to start with this question. Spotify has become a major player in podcast content and in turn in podcast advertising. So can you share a little bit about that evolution for Spotify in this space and really what makes podcasts so compelling for advertisers?
Yes. So much of it comes back to what Ross has been talking about for the past several minutes. I don't know about you, but I have become a huge fan of podcasts over the past several years. In fact, my current favorite, if anybody's looking for a recommendation, is You Must Remember This, which is old Hollywood stories. And the host, Karina Longworth, just does a tremendous job of doing deep research and crafting these amazing stories about old Hollywood. And that's really what hosts and creators do. They create this emotional connection with their listeners. And that's why it's such a critical medium for advertisers, because the audiences are so engaged there. It all started with Serial back in 2014. Fun fact, I've listened to that podcast beginning to end 4 times over the course of the past several years, because it was just such a juggernaut, and not only give you a sense of how compelling podcast content could be, but how effective advertising could be within the podcast medium. So fast forward today, as Ross has stated, 1 in 3 Americans are regular podcast listeners, and on average listen to podcasts around 50 minutes per day. So this is a place where people are, and you can get your message into their ears. On Spotify, we have 4 million podcasts, and so there are all different categories, something for every listener and something for every advertiser. On the advertising front, in 2020, we acquired Megaphone, which is what the leading podcast both serving and measurement platform, because we were really committed to ensuring that advertisers have the best experience possible when they're looking to align themselves with podcasts. And then we also, at the end of last year, added podcasts to our ad studio product, which is our self-serve ad platform. And then as far as the reasons why it's important for marketers and advertisers to think about podcasts as a medium is, we have really strong audience targeting, some very innovative things when it comes to audience targeting. We have this engaged environment like we talk about. So if somebody's looking at a search engine results page or at a site, a media site, they're going to see multiple ads on that page. When they're listening to a podcast, you're hearing one message at a time, and that really allows people to engage. And then finally, customer action. So we've really seen in our own studies on Spotify that when someone is listening to an ad on the podcast, they're more likely to take action. 81% of our listeners have said that they have taken action based on an ad that they've heard in a podcast. So as far as our audience on Spotify, we have 422 million monthly active users. 252 million of them are ad supported. So truly for us, that podcast audience is there to listen to the messages of our advertisers.
And speaking of advertisers, for someone who has not advertised on a Spotify podcast, how do you recommend they get started?
Yeah, so many more companies and brands are starting to get into podcast advertising. As Ross stated, podcast ads are going to be a quarter of this digital audio ad revenue this year. So it used to be really hard to get into podcast advertising. I've been a marketer for a long time. And I remember, 5 years ago, 8 years ago, investigating how we could get into podcast advertising. And it was tough. The minimums were very high. And there were no other options besides buying on a title by title basis. So that can be challenging. In fact, today, even now, most podcast advertising is bought on a title by title basis, but that has its limitations. In that case, you're aligning yourself with a host or creator and their content, not necessarily the audience that you're trying to find. So that's really why we've introduced this ad studio platform and also have our Spotify advertising network, which allows you to more target audiences versus particular content.
And going back to Spotify Ad Studio and targeting, what options are available for targeting?
Yeah, so just speaking about that audience-based buying, you have all the traditional things that marketers look to target against. So you have age, gender, geography, all of the general demographics. But then one great thing about doing these sorts of advertising on Spotify is we have really strong first-party data as well that's more around the behavior, the overall behavior of the listener or the context that they're in. You can imagine if you're trying to market a new fitness product that, making sure that your audience is an audience that listens to workout playlists. That's a great alignment. It makes sense. It might be a much more effective targeting than just looking at age or gender. So we offer those various options.
What about creative services? Can you tell us a little bit more about how ads come alive on the platform?
Yes, we are really committed to ensuring that, first of all, our listeners have a great experience, and secondly, our advertisers have a great experience. And that's why we lean in very heavily in ensuring that our advertisers have the tools that they need to be successful in podcast advertising. So we actually handle all of the production for podcast advertising if that's required by the advertiser. And we do that for free. So an advertiser would submit a creative brief to us. We would then generate a script, a draft script for them, which we would return to them for review and approval. And then we actually do that work with the voiceover artist to allow that ad to get recorded and produced. So we really work with our advertisers hand in hand to ensure that they have a really effective podcast ad. So that shouldn't be a challenge or a hurdle for advertisers.
And Rochelle, the last question before we jump to the audience Q&A is about reporting and what you can measure on your platform.
Yes. So we have our our podcasts that are hosted on our platform, and then through our Spotify audience network, we actually have a wider group of podcasts and platforms that we are able to distribute advertising on. So for that wider network, we are able to provide impression data, and for those ads that are served on our own platform, we're able to get a lot more robust. So we're able to talk much more about reach and frequency, and also the demographics that are being their ads are being targeted to and served against. So we provide different measurement options. If anyone is interested in learning more about those measurement options, as well as the various types of advertising that we have within Spotify, we are hosting our own webinar on June 1st that'll get much deeper into that. And there's more information about that webinar in the resources tab.
Great. Thank you, Rochelle. So now it's time to get into the audience Q&A. We've received a lot of great questions. So I'll start with this one here for Ross. Ross, in your presentation, you talked a little bit about podcast advertising in relation to digital audio, and we're wondering how it compares to terrestrial radio.
Sure. Terrestrial radio is still where most audio ad dollars are going. So just to give you some scope, podcast ad revenues right now are between $1 and $2 billion, whereas terrestrial radio is between 11 and 12 billion. So terrestrial radio is about 6x of what podcast is at. And if you looked at overall audio ad spending, so terrestrial radio and digital audio, with digital audio being music streaming in addition to podcasts, that's about an 18 to $20 billion field. And about 2/3 of that is going to terrestrial radio. Traditional radio's share of total audio dollars is declining and podcasts are growing, but the bulk of spending is still going toward traditional radio right now.
Yeah, though the trend line though for traditional radio is pretty much going to stay flat, right?
Yep. A lot like linear television, really.
Right. The next question is for Rochelle, and how is podcast measurement changing? And there's actually a related question about this later. So I think measurement is definitely a hot topic for the audience.
Yes, just like all of the different online media, measurement is continuing to evolve. So for us, a lot of that is driven by increased customization and real-time technology that we're able to deploy. So one of those is we're moving to streaming ad insertion at Spotify. So that's where an ad is actually inserted at the time of the stream versus at the time historically of a download. So that gives us a lot better sense of targeting, and also we're able to measure much better. We also recently acquired a company called Podsights that specializes in podcast ad measurement. So we're trying to make that a lot more accessible to all of our customers to ensure that they know what's really happening when they're investing in a podcast advertising with us. And then just from a product angle, we're trying to create new ways for advertisers to not only engage, but also measure that impact. And recently in the US, we launched call to action cards, which are much more of a direct response type mechanism that can be embedded within podcast advertising.
Yeah, and I think you probably answered the next question, which is what is the state of measurement for podcasts, considering the increasing demand for performance analytics by marketers? Is there anything that either you or Ross would want to add about specifically around performance advertising?
Yeah, I would say that podcasts are still right now, their sweet spot is still kind of that top and mid funnel, but there is a lot, I know on our own product roadmaps that really go towards speaking to more of those bottom funnel sort of goals of marketers. So that's something that's, I think, still evolving across many different companies. But Ross, I'm sure you have thoughts on this as well.
Well, the only thing I would add quick is that Nielsen is becoming more active in trying to measure podcast ad effectiveness. They've been involved with the audio for a long time, particularly radio, but seeing more studies that they're doing with podcast specific and even around metrics like awareness.
Next question, and Rochelle, you touched on this, so you probably want to chime in here, and Ross, you're welcome to as well. Can you use first-party data for targeting?
Yes, so it depends on so we have our own first-party data at Spotify that we are able to deploy and use for our audiences for targeting. As far as advertisers being able to bring in their own first-party data, that's something that's currently evolving. But Ross, I know you probably have a sense of the broader landscape.
I mean, my sense just in general with any ad format right now is first party data is preferable to third party data, and companies are doing their best to build products around it and make it more the norm.
I know there's been a lot of talk about host-read ads being really the mainstay of podcast advertising, but one question that a viewer has, which is interesting, is what's the recommended ad time that's proven to be the most successful? Is it 15 seconds, 30 seconds? What has generated the most number of impressions?
So I can weigh in on, we haven't done any studies, I think, that have been published, but we've done our own internal studies around, 15-second, 30-second ads, and also host-read versus voiceover talent. And what we found is it really comes down to what the marketer's goals are as to which makes more sense, right? So something like a 30-second ad makes a lot more sense if you're introducing a new product and need more time to kind of explain what that product is or create that engagement with the customer. However, if you're really just trying to continue to gain consideration over time, so some of those more mid-level, mid-funnel metrics that a 15-second ad can be really effective, especially if you can dial up the frequency of that ad. Similarly, for host-read and voiceover ads perform really well for a lot of advertisers. It just kind of depends on what your product and message is and what kind of outcomes you're looking for.
Ross, I think this next one has your name written all over it. Is podcast advertising still sold upfront?
Yes, it is.
It's a timely question.
Right now it's happening. The
Literally.
IAB upfronts are going on. Podcast advertising is still sold up front. Kind of an old school sales tactic that you see in traditional television, but you do see in podcasts. IAB just published a study, I believe it was this week actually, that had the breakdowns of where podcast ad revenues were coming from in terms of transaction methods. And about half of podcast ad dollars last year came from annual advanced commitments. So upfront spending is still very active in podcasts.
Ross, you talked about time spent, and one question from the audience: how does time spent with podcasts compare to OTT?
Yeah, so time spent with podcasts, if you're looking at among podcast listeners, not just the general population, it's a little over 50 minutes per day, just under an hour. Time spent with subscription streaming services among users of those services tends to be about 2 hours per day. So podcast listening is about half of what streaming is, or the other way to phrase that is people use streaming services about double the amount that they tune into podcasts. But both of them are becoming a pretty steady part of people's media diets, particularly people who are under 40.
So we got a couple of interesting questions about B2B. So the first question is, do these findings in the presentation pertain to consumer podcasts only or to B2B as well?
I think they would pertain to B2B as well, but I would expect B2B to have less like automation, more of the old school selling tactics. Probably more host reads, a little bit less of pre-recorded radio spots that are inserted into it. But these trends definitely pertain to it. They pertain to what we're seeing in our own behind the numbers with in terms of ad spend increasing on it and time spent as well.
And there's a related question about B2B that may be a little too detailed for at least the data that we have access to. And Rochelle, you're welcome to chime in here, but the viewer is asking, are podcasts a good medium for B2B? Any supporting data for conversions, KPIs versus other digital media?
I haven't seen the KPIs and conversion rates broken out by B2B versus B2C podcasts, so I don't have a great breakdown on how those vary. But given how many sponsored podcasts there are just in advertising trade publications, I gotta feel like that they are a good medium. People keep continually sponsoring them, and the listening on them has grown tremendously in just the last 4 to 5 years.
So we have time for 2 more questions. The first one is around brand safety for podcasts. And simply the question is, how can advertisers guarantee brand safety?
So one thing that we do is, so our advertisers have the ability to choose the types of categories that they want to advertise in, but they also have the ability to choose the types of categories they don't want to advertise in. And so we do offer exclusions to all of our advertisers, which really ensures if you don't want to show up against true crime is a huge podcast category, but some advertisers just prefer, they would rather not do that. You have the ability to exclude those categories when buying podcasts ads through our platform. And I think all of these platforms are working through just continuing to improve brand safety now. But for now, exclusion of category types is really the way that we're approaching that.
Great. And the last question is around the cost of podcast advertising. Are costs for podcast ads expected to increase dramatically, seeing that the increased demand for it appears to be at odds with the listener awareness of increased ad loads?
Well, it also depends on how the inventory is transacted. If we look at CPM data from someone like AdvertiserCast, it tends to be pretty steady. Brands are funneling more dollars, but there is an increase in listenership and it's kept prices pretty stable. But if you're looking to secure access, exclusive access to a very large, popular show, that's a whole different ordeal and a whole different negotiation strategy. And as far as those go, I have a lot less visibility into it than I do on ad unit prices.
And one thing I would mention, if advertisers are looking to get into podcast advertising and test it out, on some platforms, including ours, you can test out podcast advertising for as low as $500 for a campaign. So the threshold is pretty low to get in there and find out, like, are these thresholds something that makes sense for our business? It's not as daunting as it used to be, 5 years ago, where it would require, a $50,000, $100,000 commitment upfront.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. So thanks again to Ross for joining us, and a very special thanks to Rochelle and to the team at Spotify Advertising. And don't forget about Spotify Advertising's upcoming webinar on how to get started with podcast advertising in the ad studio. And that's on June 1st. Details can be found on the resources tab of this page. Our eMarketer production crew behind the scenes also deserves a huge thank you for making this webinar possible. As promised, we'll be emailing you soon with a link to the slides and the full recording. And before we wrap up, let me take a moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live analyst and tech talk webinars at emarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget to tune in to Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast at emarketer.com/podcast. And finally, please check out our newsletters. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your workday.